The sand burned against his face as Ensign Sakamaki struggled to keep his mind from slipping away. His fingers scraped desperately at the beach while the waves kept pounding over him, pulling at his exhausted body, dragging him deeper into that terrible morning. It was December 8, 1941, by Manalo Beach on Oahu in Hawaii's territory, and everything had gone wrong. Tucked inside his water-soaked uniform pocket was a small diary filled with words that would have meant his death if discovered by his own officers. "I have failed the Emperor. I have brought dishonor upon my family name for 10,000 generations." Those sentences had become his prison, his shame, his doom. Death seemed like the only answer left to him. Through eyes stung raw by salt water, he could see it coming. A rifle barrel pointed straight at his head, an American soldier standing above him in that grey dawn light, silhouetted against the sky. Sakamaki braced himself. He closed his eyes and waited for the shot that would finally erase his failure. The end of his shame. But it never came. Instead, he heard a voice say words that would shatter everything his entire world had taught him about the American enemy. "You are safe now. We will get you medical attention." Standing over him was Corporal David Akwai of the 298th Infantry. He didn't realize it yet, but he had just made history. Sakamaki was the first Japanese prisoner of war ever held in American custody, a man who had absolutely expected to be tortured, mutilated, and executed. Japanese propaganda had made that crystal clear to every soldier. That's what barbaric Americans did to prisoners. That's what surrender meant. But Akwai simply helped him up. What neither of these two men understood in that moment was that Sakamaki's capture would set in motion something extraordinary. Over the next 4 years, the American military would gradually dismantle Japanese military indoctrination, not through force or interrogation, but through something far more powerful, through unexpected human kindness. Between 1941 and 1945, roughly 5,000 Japanese soldiers would find themselves in POW camps on American soil. Thousands more ended up in camps controlled by Australian and New Zealand forces. When you add them all together, Western Allied forces captured somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000 Japanese prisoners during the entire war. Remarkably small numbers, really, given the scale of the fighting across the Pacific. Every single one arrived expecting brutality. Everyone had prepared themselves mentally for torture. Everyone thought they were walking toward death. What they actually encountered was something their entire training had left them completely unprepared to handle. They found hot showers, 3 meals a day, medical care. They discovered that the Geneva Convention actually meant something to their captors, that it wasn't just empty words on paper. The kindness left them devastated in ways that cruelty never could have managed. The Imperial Japanese military code had always been absolute. Death before dishonor, victory or destruction, never surrender. When the 1941 Military Field Code was distributed to every Japanese soldier, it contained no instructions whatsoever for becoming a prisoner of war. Such a thing wasn't supposed to happen. In Japanese military culture, a true warrior would die fighting or take his own life through seppuku, rather than allow himself to be taken alive. This wasn't just propaganda or talk. It was woven into the very fiber of every Japanese serviceman from his first day of enlistment. At the Imperial Naval Academy, where Sakamaki had studied, instructors drilled this into the cadets constantly. Your life belongs to the Emperor. Your personal survival means nothing. Your honor means everything. Surrender was not merely a military failure. It was spiritual contamination that would poison your ancestors and curse your descendants for generations to come. The contrast with how American soldiers were trained could not have been more different. American military culture taught the Geneva Convention and taught soldiers their rights as potential POWs. But Japanese soldiers were subjected to something much darker. They were programmed to believe that capture meant only torture and death. The military training included gruesome descriptions of supposed American atrocities, prisoners being skinned alive, prisoners being used for medical experiments, stories of cannibalistic Americans who devoured their captives. Every story was designed to make surrender seem like something worse than death. The irony was almost too much to bear. While Japanese soldiers were being conditioned to expect American barbarism, Their own military was committing documented atrocities across the Pacific with systematic brutality. The Bataan Death March had forced 60,000 Filipino prisoners and 15,000 American prisoners to walk 65 miles through tropical heat without food or water. Thousands died. It happened just months after Sakamaki's capture. When the numbers were finally tallied, Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners would kill 27% of Western prisoners. Compare that to just 4% of Allied POWs who died in German and Italian camps. The difference was staggering. Yet when Sakamaki opened his eyes in a clean hospital bed at Sand Island in Hawaii, he found American doctors carefully treating his injuries, American nurses bringing him food, American officers speaking to him with military courtesy and respect. The contradiction was unbearable for his mind to process. He begged his captors to let him commit suicide. He pleaded with them. His requests were met only with what seemed to him like incomprehensible patience and refusal. By March 9, 1942, Sakamaki arrived at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. He became the first prisoner of what would eventually grow to nearly 3,000 Japanese POWs, at what became the largest Japanese POW camp in the entire United States. The journey itself from Hawaii through San Francisco and across the American continent had been its own education. Not a cattle car, not a freight wagon. A passenger train with cushioned seats and armed guards, but also regular hot meals 3 times a day. Through the train windows, something impossible unfolded before his eyes. An America that couldn't possibly exist based on everything he'd been taught. Cities blazed with electric lights despite the war, no blackout curtains, no air raid precautions. No visible signs of total war mobilization like what had consumed Japan since 1937. Civilians walked around going about their ordinary business as if Pearl Harbor had been nothing more than a distant inconvenience. Not the devastating blow that Japanese propaganda said it was. The American military's decision to place Japanese POWs primarily at Camp McCoy, with smaller groups at Camp Kennedy in Rhode Island, Camp Clarinda in Iowa, and Angel Island in California reflected both practical thinking and strategic considerations. These locations were far from the West Coast, where anti-Japanese feeling was strongest. They were also in agricultural regions where labor was desperately needed. Camp McCoy sprawled across 60,000 acres of Wisconsin countryside. The sheer size alone stunned the Japanese prisoners, accustomed as they were to their crowded island nation. Originally built as a training facility, the camp had been quickly adapted to house prisoners as they arrived from the Pacific Theater. By 1944, it held prisoners from multiple nations, all in separate compounds with double fences and barbed wire creating barriers between them. Colonel Harold Rogers commanded the camp. He had received explicit orders from Washington. Japanese POWs would be treated strictly according to the Geneva Convention, period. No exceptions. Rogers later admitted this was one of the hardest orders he'd ever received, knowing full well what was happening to American prisoners in Japanese camps. The Japanese occupied Compound 3, separated from the Germans and Italians by those double fences topped with barbed wire. Inside the barracks, 50 men lived in individual bunks with mattresses, sheets, and blankets. To soldiers who had slept on cave floors in the Pacific, this was luxury they couldn't quite comprehend. The buildings had electric lights, hot running water, flush toilets, central heating that kept them warm through Wisconsin's punishing winters. The camp hospital particularly amazed the Japanese medical personnel among the prisoners. Unlike the desperate shortages they'd seen in combat zones, McCoy's medical facilities had X-ray machines, surgical equipment, and plenty of medications, including penicillin. The wonder drug that was still so new, most people had never heard of it. The meals, though, created the deepest psychological crisis. 3 times daily, Japanese prisoners received portions of food that exceeded anything Japanese civilians had seen since 1940. The daily ration of 2,000 to 2,100 calories matched exactly what American soldiers got: meat and vegetables and bread and butter and coffee, and sometimes even desserts. When the camp administration learned about Japanese dietary preferences, they arranged for rice and soy sauce. It was accommodation for enemy prisoners. It was consideration for comfort. It created an internal crisis. In the Japanese military, soldiers regularly starved. Here, prisoners were asked what foods they preferred. The discovery that Japanese POWs were assigned to cooking duties led to further shocks. They found electric mixers and industrial refrigerators and gas stoves that could prepare meals for thousands of people. The technology was decades beyond anything that existed in Japan. More disturbing to them was the waste. Food discarded daily because regulations required preparing extra portions just to ensure adequate supplies. Mountains of food thrown away. In Japan, that would have been unthinkable. Perhaps the most profound challenge to Japanese military ideology came from a source few expected: the camp chapel. Japanese prisoners were not just permitted to practice their religious beliefs, they were actively encouraged. A Buddhist shrine was established and maintained. The Young Men's Christian Association provided incense. American Christians were supplying materials to help enemy soldiers worship Buddha. Japanese prisoners held daily services. They celebrated Buddhist holidays. When some died from illness or injury, they conducted funeral rites with dignity and respect. It contradicted everything they had ever been taught about American cultural barbarism and disrespect. Even more shocking was the presence of Nisei soldiers serving as interpreters and guards. These were Americans of Japanese descent, many from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the Military Intelligence Service. Their own families were imprisoned in internment camps back home, yet they served their country with distinction. They guarded Japanese prisoners. They translated conversations. They represented something that made the prisoners' worldview crack even further. By the summer of 1944, American agriculture was facing severe labor shortages. Japanese POWs began working on farms across Wisconsin, Michigan, and Iowa. Unlike the slave labor that Japanese forces extracted from Allied prisoners on the Burma Railway, where 12,000 Allied prisoners died, American authorities paid Japanese prisoners 80 cents per day, the same rate as German and Italian prisoners. Payment for their labor, the farm work revealed an American agricultural abundance that simply couldn't make sense in their minds. Single Wisconsin farms produced more food than entire Japanese prefectures. Mechanical harvesters, electric milking machines, automated feed systems, technology that made one American farmer as productive as dozens of Japanese peasants combined. The relationship between Japanese prisoners and American farmers gradually shifted from mutual suspicion to something like respect. Many farmers had sons fighting in the Pacific, yet they treated Japanese prisoners with basic human dignity. They shared lunch, they taught farming techniques. Some even invited them for dinner despite regulations against fraternization. By late 1944, Camp McCoy had begun educational programs for the POWs. They could study English, American history, mathematics, basic sciences. The camp library, stocked with books in multiple languages including Japanese, became a refuge for soldiers who had been forbidden to read anything except military manuals for years. Vocational training programs appeared. Some Japanese prisoners took English classes that would later transform their lives after the war ended. American newspapers and magazines, even with wartime censorship, provided a window into democratic society that contradicted everything years of totalitarian propaganda had taught them. Christmas 1944 created a psychological crisis at Camp McCoy that challenged everything the prisoners believed about their enemy. American church groups, civic organizations, individual families, all sent Christmas packages to the camp. They sent gifts for Japanese prisoners who didn't celebrate Christmas, who followed Buddhism or Shintoism instead. Each Japanese prisoner received packages with cigarettes, candy, toiletries, warm socks, hand-knitted scarves made by strangers. The gifts came with cards written in careful handwriting. Many were clearly written by children, expressing hope for peace and prayers for the prisoners' safe return to their families. The Christmas dinner defied comprehension: turkey and ham, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, pies, food in quantities Japan hadn't seen since before the First World War. These were prisoners. These were enemies. They were being treated like people who mattered. The Japanese prisoners were invited to participate in Christmas services held in the chapel, though the response was limited. Those who ventured inside out of sheer curiosity listened as chaplains offered prayers for peace and the safe return of all soldiers to their families, even those serving as enemies. Observing the German POWs housed in separate compounds nearby gave the Japanese prisoners a striking point of comparison that challenged everything they thought they understood. The Germans inhabited their compounds with remarkable freedom. They organized athletic competitions, staged theatrical performances, published their own camp newspapers, and seemed to view imprisonment as little more than a temporary hardship. The difference was impossible to ignore. Japanese POWs had initially refused even to provide their names, offering only identification numbers instead, while German prisoners chatted openly with their guards, wrote letters back home, and discussed their plans for life after the war ended. The casual way Germans accepted their prisoner status, seemingly without shame or thoughts of suicide, gradually began to shift something in the Japanese prisoners' minds. Sports competitions held between the compounds, carefully overseen by camp officials, brought Japanese POWs face to face with German and Italian prisoners. These encounters revealed something profound. In Western military culture, being taken prisoner was viewed as an ordinary circumstance, not the ultimate humiliation that Japanese military teachings insisted it must be. Perhaps nothing challenged the grip of Japanese military indoctrination more forcefully than mail. Camp administrators encouraged Japanese prisoners to write letters home through the International Red Cross, though most initially refused, convinced their families had long since accepted them as dead, which they believed was the only respectable outcome for a captured soldier. The administration's steady insistence on explaining the rights and benefits of correspondence gradually wore down this resistance. When the first replies from families began arriving in early 1945, the effect rippled through the entire prisoner population like an earthquake. The letters expressed gratitude for their survival and love for their sons, not shame about their capture. Within weeks, dozens of Japanese POWs were writing home. The American censors who reviewed every letter proved surprisingly permissive, allowing prisoners to write honestly about conditions, their health, and how they spent their days. This openness from the enemy contradicted everything they'd been taught about American deception and cruelty. Come April 1945, as American forces pushed into Okinawa, Japanese prisoners at Camp McCoy learned about the fighting through newspapers kept in the camp library. The reporting was thorough and unflinching, including accounts of American losses and tactical difficulties. This kind of press freedom seemed almost impossible to prisoners accustomed to Japan's totalitarian media, which reported only victories and triumphs. What shocked them even more were stories describing how American forces worked deliberately to shield Okinawan civilians from the violence. Japanese military broadcasts had promised that Americans would slaughter every civilian they encountered. Yet the newspapers detailed Marines pulling people to safety, despite the danger to themselves. Medical personnel from the American Army tended to injured Japanese civilians, while engineers constructed systems to deliver fresh water to camps packed with refugees. When Okinawan survivors and civilians reached the mainland camps after being evacuated, their personal testimonies challenged every claim the military had made about American intentions toward Japanese people. These accounts from fellow Japanese people shattered another pillar of military propaganda. August 6, 1945, American newspapers announced the atomic destruction of Hiroshima that very day. The prisoners' initial response was disbelief, pure and simple. A single weapon simply could not erase an entire city from existence. When Nagasaki experienced the same fate 72 hours later, the truth became impossible to deny. The emotional response was layered and complex. Fear and horror at such devastation mixed with a kind of awe at American technological power and, strangely enough, a feeling of relief that the war would finally end without the planned invasion of the Japanese homeland that everyone knew would claim millions of lives. What moved them most, though, was witnessing the American response. Not triumph or celebration, but serious reflection on what they had done. Camp authorities organized special services following the atomic bombings, with chaplains offering prayers for the victims and expressing prayers that no nation would ever use such weapons again. This compassion shown for enemy dead demolished the last surviving remnants of propaganda about American barbarism. August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement reached Camp McCoy through newspaper translations distributed to prisoners. For Japanese POWs who had lived in captivity with the absolute belief that the fighting would continue until every Japanese person was gone, the announcement created a profound crisis of identity and purpose. The American response left them astounded once more. There was no gloating, no cruelty toward now defenseless prisoners, no reduction in rations or camp amenities. If anything, camp administrators seemed increasingly focused on prisoner welfare, establishing careful observation procedures for those in crisis and making counseling available. Colonel Rogers appeared at the Japanese prisoner sections in person, speaking through Nisei translators. "The war has finished," he told them. "You will go home once we can arrange transportation. Until that time, you remain our responsibility and under our care. Any soldier who mistreats any of you will be disciplined. You came as enemies. You will depart as future friends." Fall 1945 presented unexpected difficulties. Many Japanese POWs, particularly those captured in the war's earlier phases, felt deep anxiety about going home. The camps had changed them fundamentally, expanding their understanding and how they thought about the world. They knew the nation waiting for them was in ruins and might view them with suspicion, or worse, as people whose very survival marked them as somehow corrupted. The camp established programs to help prepare prisoners for their return. Japanese POWs received practical training in trades that would matter for rebuilding: construction work, electrical systems, modern farming methods, basic medical skills. The victorious American military was now investing time and resources into training the very men they had defeated so they could help reconstruct their nation. Before departure, prisoners received extra clothing, good shoes, and supplies for their journey home. Each man received money to take with them, funds from the nation that had defeated them, given to help them begin again. December 1945 brought the journey home. Prisoners were transported by rail to ports on the West Coast, then loaded onto ships heading across the Pacific to Japan. That train journey across America became a final glimpse of American abundance. They saw cities transitioning from wartime production back to manufacturing goods for everyday life, farmland preparing for harvests without warfare, and families greeting soldiers returning from overseas. At San Francisco, Japanese prisoners boarded vessels bound for Japan on the very same ships carrying American occupation troops heading to govern the defeated nation. The unusual reality of former adversaries traveling together toward the same destination created strange dynamics aboard ship. Occupiers and the occupied, viewed from different angles, heading toward the same future. 2 weeks passed crossing the ocean. Japanese prisoners used the time processing what it would mean to return to a homeland they knew was devastated. Many composed letters to American acquaintances, farmers where they'd worked, teachers who'd instructed them, even individual guards who treated them with consideration. Letters preserved in historical collections reveal the remarkable transformation these men had undergone. Arriving at Yokohama in January 1946, the prisoners confronted a homeland shattered beyond their worst imaginings. Entire cities had become rubble, populations were emaciated from hunger, and American occupation forces occupied the country. The returning POWs, robust and well-nourished after years in American camps, formed a stark contrast to the devastated survivors they encountered. The response to their return was complicated and mixed. Some families received them with celebration and embraces, others with disappointment and disgrace. Even in defeat, some military figures treated returned POWs as contaminated and shameful. Certain prisoners reported being pressured to take their own lives to restore honor. Yet American occupation personnel, recognizing that these POWs understood American culture and language, frequently recruited them as translators and cultural advisors. Many former prisoners discovered themselves functioning as living bridges between occupation forces and Japanese communities attempting to navigate defeat and reconstruction. Returned POWs became unexpected drivers of Japan's democratization and modernization. Their knowledge of American farming and manufacturing methods, plus their grasp of democratic thinking, made them resources during Reconstruction. Many achieved prominence in post-war Japan specifically because they comprehended what the occupiers believed and how they operated. Kazuo Sakamaki, the first documented POW, illustrates this pattern perfectly. Upon returning to Japan, he joined Toyota Motor Company, leveraging his English fluency and cultural knowledge of America to strengthen Japan's automotive export business. By 1969, he had advanced to directing Toyota's subsidiary in Brazil, an achievement that simply would not have occurred without his time as a prisoner. He lived into his 90s, passing away in 1999, and rarely discussed his wartime experience until a 1991 reunion where he saw his former submarine, preserved in a Texas museum. Other former POWs brought American agricultural methods that transformed Japanese farming practices. Some launched businesses modeled on American enterprises, others taught English and Western practices, and still others worked with government agencies on democratic transitions. They testified consistently that Americans were not the demonic forces wartime propaganda had depicted, but could be reliable partners in building peace. The educational experiences prisoners gained in American camps shaped Japan's entire approach to post-war education. These men, having spent time reading uncensored materials, comprehended how education fueled both democracy and economic progress. The camp libraries, with their unrestricted newspapers, influenced Japan's commitment to press independence. Multiple former POWs established careers in journalism in occupied Japan, advocating for the media openness they had encountered as prisoners. The experience of encountering different perspectives and alternative ways of organizing society enabled these former POWs to help guide Japan's remarkable conversion from militaristic nation to functioning democracy. Their experiences became the bridge connecting military defeat to national rebuilding. The deepest influence of their American captivity went beyond practical knowledge and touched something moral. Military training had taught these soldiers that showing mercy equaled weakness. Yet they discovered that American power rested partly on moral conviction, the ability to show humanity to enemies without undermining their own strength. This understanding surfaces repeatedly in what they later wrote and said. Former POWs struggled describing how American compassion had wounded their convictions more thoroughly than cruelty ever could have. Mistreatment would have validated the propaganda they'd been fed. Kindness demolished it completely. The contrast with how Japanese forces had treated Allied prisoners created deep personal turmoil. As information surfaced about atrocities at places like Burma, about the Burma Railway forced labor camps and systematic brutality toward captives, former Japanese POWs who had experienced American kindness grappled with national humiliation and their own internal transformation. An unusual dimension of camp existence that shaped many returned POWs involved observing American women's participation in wartime activities. Female medical personnel, administrative workers, and support staff at camps illustrated capacities that Japanese culture had restricted to men alone. Some prisoners labored on farms where women operated heavy equipment and ran operations independently while their husbands were away at war. This observation of alternative roles for women influenced certain returned POWs regarding women's potential and place in society. Having witnessed how American productivity benefited from deploying all available human capability regardless of gender, they carried these insights back to Japan, which would eventually implement its own transformation of gender relations. Beyond techniques for farming and manufacturing, Japanese POWs learned American systems for managing work and solving complex problems. The camp environment demonstrated that American effectiveness derived not from individual brilliance, but from repeatable procedures and processes that any person could grasp and implement. The mechanical procedures particularly impressed them. They had grown accustomed to using equipment until it broke down, then replacing it. American camp vehicles and machinery received consistent preventive care. Regular oil changes, timely component replacements, systematic maintenance schedules. What the prisoners learned there influenced how Japanese industry operated after the war. The atmosphere of religious practice in the American camps also shaped post-war Japan's approach to spirituality and faith. When Japanese prisoners of war returned home from American camps, they carried something far more valuable than material goods. They brought ideas that would reshape their nation. These men had practiced their Buddhist faith openly during captivity, a freedom they'd never experienced under Japan's rigid state Shinto system. Many had received Christmas kindness from American soldiers and civilians, acts of compassion that opened their eyes to Christianity in ways military propaganda had never prepared them for. While few converted to the Christian faith, the experience left them with genuine respect for the charity they'd witnessed firsthand. This shift in perspective would prove crucial when American missionaries later arrived in occupied Japan. The returned prisoners became unexpected allies to religious tolerance, concepts that seemed radical in a nation where the state had controlled all spiritual expression. But perhaps the most profound changes came through something simpler: letters from home. Wives wrote expressing their relief and joy that their husbands had survived. Parents confessed they valued their living sons far more than the dead heroes the military propaganda celebrated. Children simply wanted their fathers back, unconcerned with military honor or notions of shame. These messages shattered the conditioning that had been hammered into every soldier's mind since childhood. Loyalty to family suddenly seemed just as important, perhaps even more important, than loyalty to the state. This realization transformed how returned prisoners lived their lives. They prioritized their families in ways that seemed almost rebellious within rigid Japanese corporate culture. They'd seen American soldiers and workers constantly talking about their families, showing photographs, planning reunions. These American men hadn't been weak for putting family first, they'd been strong. This lesson stuck with the returning prisoners and changed how they raised their own children. Military psychologists had watched all this closely. They studied the Japanese prisoners systematically, documenting the remarkable psychological transformations occurring within the camps. These men had arrived with conditioning so intense that many required suicide prevention for months. They'd been trained since childhood that surrender meant shame, that capture meant torture and death. Yet something unexpected happened. Prolonged exposure to humane treatment, genuine educational opportunities, and fundamentally different ways of thinking gradually rewrote their understanding of what it meant to be strong, honorable, and human. The research these psychologists conducted would influence the entire American occupation strategy. MacArthur's staff included former camp administrators who understood Japanese psychology from intimate observation. They knew how to navigate the occupation without triggering the very resistance they hoped to avoid. These insights proved invaluable. Several of Japan's revolutionary business innovations traced directly back to what prisoners had observed during captivity. The Toyota production system, which would eventually transform global manufacturing, incorporated efficiency concepts that Toyota employees had learned in American camps. The principles seemed simple, yet profound. Eliminate waste, pursue continuous improvement, respect your workers. These ideas weren't invented in captivity, but they were refined and remembered there. The convenience store concept that revolutionized Japanese retail came from similar observations. American camp exchanges had shown prisoners something elegant in their simplicity, small stores offering diverse goods efficiently organized. When these men returned home and began building businesses, these images stayed with them. Returned prisoners became cultural interpreters during the occupation and far beyond. Their experience was genuinely unique. They'd seen America from inside while remaining fundamentally Japanese. Both societies needed these bridges, and these men could build them like no one else could. Many maintained correspondence with American camp staff and the families who had shown them kindness. These personal connections, documented in various archives, reveal reconciliation happening at the grassroots level, long before any official alliance was formally established. Yet these same men faced a bitter irony upon returning home. Japanese military authorities often denied them veteran benefits, considering surrender inherently dishonorable regardless of circumstance. For decades, they were excluded from veteran organizations and commemorations, officially dishonored by the very nation they'd helped rebuild through the knowledge and connections they'd acquired. It wasn't until the 1970s that Japanese POW associations finally formed, organizations dedicated to advocating for recognition and preserving the experiences that had been suppressed for so long. After Emperor Hirohito's death in 1989, a cultural shift occurred, and these former prisoners finally began speaking publicly about their experiences, contributing meaningfully to Japanese understanding of wartime history and American relations. The effects rippled through generations. Children of returned prisoners often exhibited unusual characteristics in Japan's conformist society, questioning authority more readily, valuing individual expression, pursuing international careers. Grandchildren showed even stronger international orientation, many drawn to study abroad, particularly in America, influenced by family stories of unexpected kindness from former enemies. These educational exchanges rooted in prisoner experiences strengthened Japanese-American relations across generations. Japanese academics studied the POW phenomenon intensively, recognizing it as a unique window into both American society and Japanese psychology. The research revealed consistent patterns: the initial death wish that dominated prisoners' minds, the gradual acceptance of survival, the hunger for education, the profound worldview changes, and the anxiety many felt about returning home. This research influenced Japanese military education reform, eliminating the brutal indoctrination about death before dishonor and incorporating Geneva Convention training. American scholars also recognized the unique value of these experiences. They studied how deeply held beliefs so fundamental they seemed unshakable, could be transformed through humane treatment and exposure to different perspectives. These insights contributed to broader understanding of human psychology and social transformation. The 50th anniversary of the war's end in 1995 brought renewed attention to these stories. Joint Japanese-American commemorations featured former prisoners sharing testimony about the unexpected American kindness that had helped transform enemies into allies. Kazuo Sakamaki's return to America in 1991 for a historical conference generated particular attention. The first Japanese POW meeting his submarine, now preserved as a museum, created a powerful visual metaphor for transformation. His emotional reaction, broadcast internationally, humanized history for new generations, showing them how former enemies had become allies through connections forged even in captivity. The Camp McCoy History Center in Wisconsin maintains extensive Japanese POW archives, including artifacts, letters, and photographs donated by survivors and their families. These materials, increasingly digitized for worldwide access, provide researchers globally with primary sources documenting successful enemy rehabilitation. Educational exchanges between American and Japanese communities continue strengthening bilateral relations, exchanges rooted in wartime prisoner experiences. The numbers tell a remarkable story. Approximately 5,000 Japanese prisoners were held in camps on the American mainland, out of 35,000 to 50,000 total captured by Western allies, most held in Australia and New Zealand. Camp McCoy in Wisconsin was the largest American facility, housing up to 3,000 prisoners at its peak. Other camps included Camp Kennedy in Rhode Island, Camp Clarinda in Iowa, and Angel Island in California. Daily rations provided 2,800 calories, identical to what American soldiers received. Prisoners earned 80 cents per day for agricultural labor. The mortality rate in American camps remained extraordinarily low. By contrast, 27% of Allied prisoners died in Japanese camps. Escape attempts from American camps were minimal. Most Japanese prisoners made no attempt to flee. The broader lesson transcended statistics and logistics. America's treatment of Japanese prisoners had been guided by principled adherence to international law, even when enemies violated those same laws horrifically. This asymmetric morality, treating adversaries better than they treated you, proved strategically brilliant. Returned prisoners became inadvertent American ambassadors. Their testimonies about unexpected kindness undermined anti-American propaganda more effectively than any propaganda campaign could achieve. The economic benefits proved substantial as well. Japan's post-war economic miracle had been partly enabled by former prisoners introducing American methods and maintaining business connections. Major Japanese corporations deliberately employed former prisoners specifically for their knowledge of American business practices and their ongoing relationships. But beyond strategy and economics lay something deeper, a moral victory. America had demonstrated democracy's superiority through example rather than force. The transformation of Japanese prisoners from fanatical enemies to grateful allies showed that kindness could accomplish what violence couldn't. These men had arrived expecting cruelty, perhaps torture or death. They left understanding that life, properly lived, could honor both personal dignity and international peace. Their transformation proved that enemies need not remain enemies forever. The kindness experienced as prisoners became seeds of alliance that eventually flourished into one of history's strongest international partnerships. Today's Japan-United States relationship had been built on former enmity transformed through humanity. Camp chaplains praying for enemy dead, farmers sharing lunch with prisoner workers, families sending Christmas gifts to enemies. Ordinary Americans demonstrating extraordinary decency achieved what military victory alone could not. They created genuine transformation of hearts and minds. When contemporary international conflicts seem intractable and enemies appear irredeemable, this history offers genuine hope. It proves kindness can be stronger than cruelty, mercy can achieve what force cannot, that today's adversaries might become tomorrow's allies if treated with dignity, despite past enmity. The Japanese soldiers who expected torture but received kindness, who anticipated death but discovered life, who arrived as enemies but left as friends, remind us that transformation remains possible even in humanity's darkest moments. Their journey from attacking Pearl Harbor to rebuilding Japan with American assistance demonstrates that cycles of vengeance can be broken through principled humanity. America's greatest victory in the Pacific War wasn't purely military. By treating Japanese prisoners with unexpected kindness, America conquered Japanese military forces, but achieved a deeper victory still, proving that democratic values could transform even the most thoroughly indoctrinated enemies. The approximately 5,000 Japanese prisoners who experienced American humanity on American soil, alongside thousands more in Allied camps elsewhere, carried that experience back to Japan. They became seeds of democracy and friendship in previously hostile soil. Their preserved testimonies in archives and family memories continue teaching that enemies need not remain enemies if courage exists to break the hatred cycle through unexpected grace. This historical episode deserves remembrance not merely as wartime curiosity, but as a blueprint for transforming modern conflicts. If Japanese soldiers programmed for death before dishonor could become democratic citizens through experienced kindness, then today's seemingly intractable enemies might also transform through principled humanity. The American guards who protected suicidal prisoners, the doctors who healed enemy wounded, the teachers who educated hostile students, the chaplains who prayed for enemy souls. These ordinary people performing extraordinary kindness achieved lasting victory through moral courage. Their example continues inspiring, reminding us that true strength lies not in destroying enemies, but in transforming them. The Japanese prisoners' journey from expecting torture to experiencing kindness, from anticipating death to discovering life, from arriving as enemies to leaving as friends, demonstrates democracy's deepest strength, its ability to transform opponents through example rather than force. Their experience proves that mercy can achieve what might cannot, that kindness can conquer where cruelty fails. The story ends not with conquest, but with conversion, not with submission, but with transformation, not with continued enmity, but with lasting friendship. These Japanese soldiers experienced something more powerful than military defeat. They experienced the transformative power of unexpected kindness that changed their fundamental understanding of strength, honor, and humanity itself. Their legacy continues in every Japanese-American business partnership, educational exchange, and strategic alliance. The kindness shown to prisoners 80 years ago created human connections that transcended wartime hatred and built bridges between former enemies that strengthen with each passing generation. This proves that humanity's best qualities can emerge even in war's worst moments, and that the most powerful victory of all is transformation of the human heart.